Happy Purim, everyone. And I apologize that this is going live a little bit on the late side. 13 minutes late to be precise, but it's Purim. And Purim, even more than a holiday, maybe not more than, but in addition to being a holiday of merrymaking and eating and drinking and having a good time, it's a holiday that's full of mitzvot. I think part of why Purim is a holiday of simcha, of joy, is because it's a holiday where we're cramming so many mitzvot into such a short time. And there is no greater simcha, no greater joy than simcha shel mitzvah, the joy of fulfilling the commandments of the Creator. And so on this day that comes when we've got 24 hours in which to hear the Megillah, give matanot le'evyonim, gifts of money or food to the poor, and give shalach manos, gifts of food to our fellows, and hear the Megillah again, and also have a festive meal ourselves and maybe get a little bit tipsy for those who partake of alcohol. It's a lot to fit into a day. And then this year, we add on top of that it's Friday. We also have to get ready for Shabbos. And it's quite a lot to fit in, but that means it's a lot of mitzvot to give us simcha. And so whether we have so many mitzvot because this is a day of tremendous joy, and so we need mitzvot to express that joy, or we have so much joy today because of all the mitzvot, I don't know. That's a question for another time. I want to talk about the Megillah, the story of Purim. Megillat Esther, the scroll of Esther, is a strange book. It's the only book in the Bible that God's name is not mentioned in. None of the names of God that explicitly refer to God appear in the book. But there's many ways to read this book. People read it as history. We can read it as history, as a story about things that happened that were of import to our people, the Jewish people, and shaping how we see ourselves and our place in the world. We can read it as comedy. This is a crazy story, and just like the great Shakespearean comedies, there are reversals. Vanahafochu, things get turned upside down. The one that was going to be the oppressor becomes the oppressed, and the one that was going to be oppressed becomes the oppressor. The king who has such disdain for all womankind that he has his agents kidnap young women from all over the country to audition in a perverse kind of way for the role of queen, and who has no qualms about condemning these hundreds of young women to lives of solitude when they are not chosen. That king who lives the ultimate embodiment of patriarchy winds up being led and controlled and improved by his wife, who winds up calling the shots. The reversal, there's so many reversals. So maybe it's a comedy, and there is plenty of irony in the story to lead us to that conclusion. We could also read the Megillah as tragedy. That this young woman, Esther, is a tragic hero who sacrifices herself in order to save her people. She gives up her freedom and happiness, condemned to live a life married to a man she doesn't love, who she never chose to be with, because she stepped forward to save her people. And her willingness to put her life, not only her freedom, but her life on the line, and ultimately her life is spared, but her freedom she never gets back. That's what saves the people. So maybe it's a tragedy. But I want to read the Purim story this year, and how I'm reading it more and more as I read it is not as comedy or tragedy or even as history, but I'm reading it as a parable. There's a movie that came out a number of years ago, and I never got around to seeing it until we showed it outside at Base 8. We had a movie night. They say it's one of these movies that they say is a children's movie, but it's a movie that is appropriate for all people, including children, Inside Out. And it's this movie where the drama of the movie doesn't take place in the world. It takes place among the different facets of one girl's psyche. And I read the Purim story, I read the Megillah as being a little bit like that movie Inside Out, where the four central characters, Esther, Mordechai, Haman, and Achashverosh, represent four facets of the human psyche, or if you will, the human soul. We're used to, those of us who live in the modern Western world, influenced by the contributions of Freud, we're used to thinking of sort of three components of the human psyche: the id, the ego, and the superego. And if we're coming from a more traditional Jewish perspective, maybe we also have three. We have the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, the Yetzer Hatov, the good inclination, and the soul, caught in the middle, trying to make good choices, pulled in one direction or another by those two warring impulses. But the Megillah, if we read it as a parable, presents a more complicated picture of the human soul. And I'm not saying we don't read it as historical events about real people. But in addition to that story, I think it also can be read as telling the story of what happens in the life of one human soul. And it's called Megillat Esther. The star of the story is Queen Esther. I think Esther is the soul, the free will, that I that's inside each of us that's trying to make good choices. And there are different forces vying for control of this I, this soul, this Esther, the hidden mystery within all of us. On the one hand, we have King Ahasuerus. Who is King Ahasuerus? King Ahasuerus is someone who is led by pleasure. Everything King Ahasuerus does is designed to gratify his own desires. He marries a woman. When she makes him angry, he banishes her, divorces her. If you read the Midrash, has her executed. He has his agents scour the land looking for young women to gratify his desires. He eats, he drinks some more. In every scene we see King Ahasuerus, almost he's drinking. This is a man of appetite. So King Ahasuerus represents our desire for pleasure. And we might try to equate that with the Freudian id, but I think it's a little more complicated because there's different kinds of desires. And King Ahasuerus seems to represent that part of ourselves. We might call it the Yetzer Hara, we may call it the id, that just wants pleasure. It just wants pleasure, and it doesn't want pain. So it gives him pleasure, he likes, he thinks it's good, and what causes him pain he does not like. And he's very easily led, because desire doesn't, the part of us that is desire doesn't have an agenda. It just wants what it wants. Then there is Mordechai, who's trying to influence Esther to do the right thing. He raised her up, and when she's in the palace of the king, the soul subject to the whims of desire, as many of us live our lives, we spend our lives feeling like we are slaves to our desires. Mordechai, we might call him the Yetzer HaTov, is counseling Esther that she has to assert herself and she has to advocate for herself and for her people, even at the peril of her life. He's advocating for her to make hard choices, to be self-sacrificing. So Mordechai is the voice of morality, that piece within us that wants to do the right thing. So there's a part of every soul that just wants pleasure. And there's a part of every soul that wants to do the right thing. And sometimes those are harmonious. Mordechai and Achashverosh can get along a lot of the time, right? A person wants to get married. That should be a pleasure. That's also the right thing to do. It's a good thing to do. Have a family can give us pleasure, but it's also a good thing to do. Doing nice things for our friends gives us pleasure, and it's a good thing to do. There are plenty of things that are mitzvot, that are commandments, that are good deeds, ma'asim tovim, and that are also giving us pleasure. But of course, there's plenty that's the opposite. And Achashverosh has no bounds. There's no authority over him. No one can tell him, you can't do that thing that you want to do. So there's Mordechai, there's Achashverosh, and then there's Haman. Who's Haman? If we read this story as history, Haman is that person in every society, in every generation, who hates the Jews, who hates the outsiders, who fears foreigners and people who are different, and who wants to eliminate them. That's the history read. But this parable about the human soul, Haman, what's Haman led by? Before Haman decides to wipe out the Jews, what does he want? What is he going for? He wants and craves honor, respect, power, glory. And he is very good at achieving those things. He gets the king to elevate him to a high position. And once he's there, Haman, of course, is not happy, because it doesn't matter that all the king's officers, all the most powerful and wealthiest and most famous people in the world bow down before him, because there's one guy, Mordechai, who doesn't respect him. Because that voice inside of us that is led by the desire for the good, for doing the right thing, has no respect for power and prestige and image. And that drives Haman crazy, that there's one person who won't bow down to him. And this is so true for so many of us. We think of Haman as the monster of the story, but I think he's very relatable, because all of us have this experience of we get something that we want. For Haman, it was the power of being the second in command of the kingdom. But once we get what we want, we discover that there's something wrong. There's always going to be something wrong. We're not living in Olam Haba, in Gan Eden. We're not living in a perfect world yet. And so there's always going to be something wrong. And there's that part of ourselves that craves power and more and recognition is always going to find something lacking in whatever we do achieve. And so Haman, that voice in our souls that wants other people to love us and respect us and at least fear us, is driven crazy that this silly Jew over here won't bow down to him. And Haman's response is a scorched earth response. He's going to wipe out all the Jews. And look, I'm not saying we're all genocidal maniacs, but I think we all have this voice in us that when it doesn't get what it wants is prepared to burn down the world. And the only reason that we don't go in the direction of Haman, as some people do, is because we also have a Mordechai inside of us. And we also have a Achashverosh inside of us. And we are our Esther, who's subject to the influence and the overtures of these three voices. But we ultimately have to make the choice for ourselves. And I don't think we can get rid of the Yetzer Hara, what's often called the evil inclination. You know, there's stories in the Talmud about the rabbis trying to destroy the evil inclination, and things go bad. There's no fresh eggs in the market. But what's interesting is in the Purim story, we don't destroy the pleasure drive, Achashverosh. Achashverosh is still there at the end of the story. But Haman, the other Yetzer Hara, the part of the Yetzer Hara that wants power and prestige and glory, he's killed. He's hanged from a tree. He's out of the story. And I think that there's a lesson here about our own moral, spiritual journeys. If we think we can get rid of our desires, we're kidding ourselves. They tried to get rid of Achashverosh at the beginning of the story, the king of desire. Two of his courtiers realized the world would be a lot better without this drunk, philandering king. Let's get rid of him. But it didn't work. They got caught. And that's actually what brought Haman to power in the story. But we can't get rid of the pleasure drive. But what we can do is turn the tables so that instead of our souls being ruled by Achashverosh, by pleasure, we can turn things around so that we control, influence our pleasure drive. We have to be clever about it. Esther had to seduce Achashverosh into doing what she wanted. At the end of the story, when she says, as she's asking him to hang Haman to hang Haman and his sons from the tree and give the Jews the power to liberate themselves, she says to him, "Do this if I am good in your eyes." But it's ambiguous in the Hebrew. She's saying, "Do you trust me? Do you think I'm a good person?" But she's also saying, Do I look good to you? Am I good in your eyes? So she's simultaneously appealing to his morality, which in this parable, this is a king without morality. He's just ruled by pleasure. So she has to, at the same time, appeal to his desire. And so within ourselves, we have to seduce our own pleasure drive into doing the right thing because there's pleasure in doing the right thing. In being ruled by our deepest, highest will, desire, rather than by simple pleasure, because that's actually the greatest pleasure. That ultimately our pleasure drives are in love with our own souls. The king Achashverosh is in love with Esther more than all the women of the world. And we have to take that desire to know our own soul and harness that to trick our desires into following our souls and doing what we deeply want rather than the other way around. But when it comes to the other Yetzer Hara, the Yetzer Hara of wanting glory and power and prestige and hating those who won't acknowledge us or who make us feel bad, the Yetzer Hara of Haman, that Yetzer Hara we have to eliminate, and we can eliminate. And we have to wipe it out of the story. It's a mitzvah to wipe out the memory of Amalek, the ancestor of Haman. We blot out Haman's name because there's no place for that. Because unlike the pleasure drive, nothing good comes from the desire to have power, the desire to have glory, the desire for prestige. And ultimately, in the end of the day, we want to find some way of living in harmony and in the tension between the pleasure drive, Achashverosh, the desire for what is right, Mordechai, and ultimately eliminating and wiping out of the story that desire for power and glory within ourselves. And I want to bless us all this Purim and in this Shabbat that's coming, that we find that harmony between the Mordechai and the Achashverosh within us, and that ultimately everyone can be ruled by and in service to the queen of ourselves, our own souls, our own free will, the Esther, the hidden divine spark within us. And let's blot out that memory of Haman. If you're tuning in live, in about 25 minutes, we're going to be live streaming the Megillah reading from right here for those who are unable to attend an in-person reading today. All right, Shabbat Shalom and Chag Purim Sameach.